If you're Gen Z or a millennial, or even an older millennial on the border of Gen X like me, you probably heard a healthy amount of dragging your entire generation, mostly from folks older than you. You've almost certainly heard the words lazy, entitled, spoiled, lacking character, soft. Any number of these terms meant to cast you and everyone your age as unworthy of inheriting the mantle of American leadership. Well, if you know your history, you know this ain't nothing new. 2,000 years ago, near the collapse of the Roman Republic, Cicero was already doing the back in my day routine. He complained that the youth were arrogant, disrespectful, obsessed with luxury, and unwilling to do the hard work of holding the republic together. They didn't honor tradition. They only cared about themselves, and they were letting the society their forebears had built go to hell in a handbasket. Sound familiar? What's up, everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is another episode of Past Is Prologue, where I dig into the earlier chapters of history to figure out what the hell is going on right now. Today, I want to talk to you about a tradition that cuts across just about every period of American history. Older generations blaming younger generations for everything that feels broken to the olds in our shared society. The language changes a little, but the core charges are obnoxiously consistent. You're lazy. You don't respect your elders. You're soft. You've lost sight of traditional values. Your music is trash. And whatever you're doing is definitely going to destroy the country. Whenever I hear this petty, reactionary nonsense, a couple things come to mind. One, generational trash talk is not new. It's a cultural reflex you could set your watch to. Two, it almost always shows up when the structure of society is shifting, when the economy, technology, gender roles, or race relations are undergoing serious revision. Younger people adapt fastest, and they catch all the shit from the old folks who don't like these changes because, generally, people aren't comfortable with transformation, especially the deep, society-altering kind. In other words, the kids are not usually the cause of the crisis. They're just the most visible symptom of a world the olds no longer recognize. So let's walk through some of the prominent examples of you goddamn whippersnappers pearl clutching in American history, from the market revolution to TikTok. Starting with the market revolution in the early 1800s, the world that Thomas Jefferson imagined and a lot of early Americans tried desperately to preserve is a republic of yeoman farmers. You work your land, your family is your labor force, you trade locally, you're not chasing profit for its own sake or for the stuff that it can buy. Many Americans believe this lifestyle built virtue, self-control, hard work, piety, deference to elders. When the market revolution blows that model to smithereens, canals, steamboats, roads, and later railroads and telegraphs turned scattered local economies into one big national market. Some Americans start to chase profit more by becoming entrepreneurial. I talked about this in a recent episode, a couple actually. Master artisans becoming manufacturers, yeomen turning into commercial crop producers, general store owners evolving into nodes in a national distribution network. Store-bought goods and wage labor become far more common in 1825 than they were in 1800. And it's young people who jump on all of this first. It's sons who know they're not inheriting the family farm because land is scarce or smallholder farming is becoming unsustainable. They head to town, they look for wage work. Daughters go to textile mills to earn their own money, and as they do this, they get a taste of independence. Families can't rely on their children as labor the way they once did, and kids who hated that arrangement from the jump start buying, literally, their way out of it, paying for the privilege to leave, go out on their own. Young men and women spend their wages on manufactured clothes, clocks, furniture, stuff their parents either made themselves or never had. Naturally, the older folks interpret this as a slap in the face. To a lot of them, it isn't just economic change, it's moral decay. They say the youth are abandoning the honest simplicity of farm life for materialism and comfort. They're becoming wage slaves to distant bosses. They're losing the discipline and self-denial that supposedly come from sweating in a field from sunup to sundown. Keep in mind, many of these older Americans grew up without the things we consider incredibly basic now. Shoes, made by actual shoemakers. Soap, comfortable clothes, solid, non-earthen floors. To them, to this generation, the independence of subsistence farming, not owing anyone anything, and carving your own life out of the wilderness, that was freedom. So when they see young people buying clothes, living in towns, working for wages, or choosing comfort over hardship, they react like this is a civilizational emergency. Sermons, newspapers, and older politicians all say some version of the young care only for profit, luxury, and the self. They no longer respect God, family, or community. I know it's weird for us to think of a change of clothes or a pair of shoes as a luxury, but that's exactly how the older generation saw it. So let's be clear. Yes, there was real disruption. Yes, the young people did behave differently than their parents. But the older generation frames those adaptations as moral failure, not as a rational response to a new economic world that older elites helped create. Even if regular folks didn't personally ask for this transformation, their political and economic leaders absolutely did. So the world is changing, and young people have the audacity to change with it. How dare they? Things were just fine the way they were, damn it. Sound familiar yet? Fast forward to the late 1800s, what Mark Twain famously labeled the Gilded Age. Railroads crisscross the country now. Factories are popping up all over the United States. Cities explode in population as Chicago, New York, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland all become magnets for young people who want jobs, excitement, and the experience of something beyond the family farm or the crossroads town their parents never left. Again, it's the kids moving first. Young women work in department stores, offices, and factories. Young men work on railroads, in steel mills, in slaughterhouses, or in mines, among a number of other entrepreneurial opportunities that present themselves with the new industrial economy. There are saloons, vaudeville theaters, dance halls, and amusement parks. These are new spaces where youth culture starts to become a thing. It didn't really exist before the late 19th century. Older rural Americans recoil in horror at all of this. From their perspective, the young people are deserting their families, falling into the sin of the city, alcohol, prostitution, gambling, cheap amusements, and, if we're being honest, this is not entirely untrue. The young people are losing the sturdy Protestant work ethic of their ancestors. So the blame game spins out like this. Cities are corrupt, sure. But really, it's these kids who are weak. They're seduced by the easy life and by pleasure because they don't have the backbone and the values that we had back in the day. If this sounds like bullshit, it's probably because it is. The economic landscape had significantly changed since the Civil War began in 1861. Farming got harder and far less profitable for smaller operators, even more so than in the previous generation I was talking about. Industrial jobs, even brutal ones, offer cash wages and a chance to move up. The city is where the opportunity is, and young people take the risk because they have the least to lose. But instead of seeing that as a structural shift, a capitalism problem, a labor problem, a policy problem, older generations turn it into a moral indictment of the youth. Okay, next stop, the early 20th century, what's often called the Progressive Era. By this point, the industrial city is here to stay, regardless of the olds wearing out their fainting couches about it. Big business ain't going anywhere either. And along with these big changes come terrible working conditions, low pay, child labor, nakedly corrupt politics, and staggering inequality. Guess who gets particularly fired up about fixing all these problems? Yep, it's the terrible, weak, lazy, entitled kiddos. College-educated reformers, particularly young women, create settlement houses. Labor organizers flirt with socialism, communism, or anarchism, or outright embrace them. Feminists and suffragettes push for a woman's right to vote and for equality before the law for the sexes. Energetic idealists join movements for food safety, housing reform, workplace safety, and the preservation of natural resources. This is when the national park system gets its start. To a lot of older business and political elites, these kids are naive dreamers who don't understand economics, dangerous radicals who are going to destroy capitalism, disrespectful upstarts who don't know their place, especially the women and immigrants who should just be grateful for the table scraps. You can almost hear the Rush Limbaugh rant in 1912. These young people don't appreciate what they've been given. They want something for nothing. They're lazy, entitled, and they're tearing down the traditions that made this country great. The reality is that industrial capitalism itself is tearing up traditions. Parents and children no longer work side by side on a farm. Kids are in factories or increasingly in schools. Women are starting to imagine public roles beyond marriage and motherhood because the economy actually needs teachers, nurses, clerks, typists, what are traditionally considered women's work. And with greater expectations of everyone, of fucking course, those who haven't been given one are going to demand a seat at the table to make some fucking decisions. But again, instead of saying, wow, our whole economic and social model has changed, a lot of older folks say, these damn kids with their unions and suffrage and socialism are the problem. If the obvious has not smacked you in the face yet, maybe you want to check your hearing. Now, for the 1920s, the Jazz Age. If you want a classic kids these days decade, man oh man, is this ever it. Cars make teenagers and young adults capable of being unsupervised and mobile for the first time in human history. Yikes. Jazz clubs, speakeasies, and dance halls give them places to gather out of parental view with non-white people. Double yikes. Short skirts, bobbed hair, makeup, necking in cars, college football games, movies, all of this becomes wrapped up in what it means to be young. And most of this is stuff that Americans who came of age on a farm have absolutely no experience with. Holy fucking hormones, Batman. Older Americans go absolutely ballistic. The accusations are incredibly familiar. The youth are too sexual, too immodest, too obsessed with pleasure. They're materialistic and frivolous, wasting money on clothes, records, alcohol, and cars. They don't respect marriage, religion, or authority. It's the same tired, I don't understand this, and I didn't experience it, so it has to be bad. But what's actually going on here? For one, World War I has just ended, and an entire generation has seen mass death and trauma, directly or indirectly. The economy has shifted toward mass production and mass consumption. There are actual consumer goods to buy now, and the advent of ubiquitous advertising makes it impossible to ignore the temptation to spend your money. Urbanization and new technologies make anonymity and experimentation possible in ways that didn't exist before. Once again, young people adapt fastest to a world their parents didn't grow up in, and the parents interpret that adaptation as a moral collapse, not as a reasonable response to new conditions. Okay, let's jump ahead to a little more familiar territory for a lot of you. The 1960s and early 1970s, the era most Americans think of when they hear generation gap. The baby boomers grew up in a United States that is economically dominant, in the middle of the Cold War, deeply segregated by race, and forced to really acknowledge it for the first time, sending young men to fight and die in Vietnam, which is a conflict most Americans don't understand from the jump. What do a lot of young people do? They join civil rights movements. They risk beatings and arrests to challenge Jim Crow. They protest the Vietnam War and the draft. They experiment with drugs, new forms of spirituality, rock music, and communal living. They push boundaries on age, gender roles, interracial relationships, and on authority in general. Older Americans, including a lot of veterans of World War II, see this as an utter betrayal. The script sounds like this. Spoiled kids who never had to sacrifice are spitting on the flag. They're lazy hippies who don't want to work, just get high and have sex. They're abandoning traditional family values and Christian morals. I didn't survive the Great Depression and fight the Germans and the Japanese for this shit. Never mind that. Many boomers marching against the war are the ones being forced to get their balls blown off for they don't know what in Vietnam. The civil rights movement is demanding that America live up to its stated values finally, not just sweep the systemic racism under the rug anymore. The post-war economic order and suburban model literally made it possible for teenagers and 20-somethings to have time and space to question everything. Once again, the structural contradictions and injustices of the society land in the laps of the young. And instead of confronting those things, a huge chunk of the older generation chooses the easier story. The kids are the problem. And here's the kicker. Decades later, a lot of these same boomers who were told they would destroy America turn around and recycle the same goddamn bullshit talking points about the generations that come after. It is maddening to me. On to the present. Finally, we hit the generations getting roasted in real time. Millennials and Gen Z. You know the drill. Millennials killed cable, casual dining chains, home ownership, diamonds, fucking cereal, you name it. They're supposedly entitled, participation trophy softies who don't want to work. Gen Z is chronically online, glued to their phones, fragile, too woke, lazy, and more interested in vibes than responsibilities. The greatest hits of the olds runs on a loop. They don't want to put in the hours. They expect everything handed to them. They have no respect for tradition, marriage, religion, or the flag. At the same time, we have, in this country, stagnant wages relative to productivity, skyrocketing housing and education costs, massive student debt loads, climate change looming over literally everything. I don't think a day goes by that I don't feel the gnawing anxiety that the planet is dying. A labor market increasingly built on precariousness, gigs, and flexibility that benefits employers far more than it does the laborers. And this is personal for me. I finished my master's in teaching and single subject credential 3 weeks before Lehman Brothers declared bankruptcy. So I have experienced the shit hitting the fan. And now, when younger people job hop instead of pledging loyalty to one company, openly talk about mental health, question whether grinding 60 hours a week for a remorseless corporation is a great way to spend the one life that you have, or challenge long-standing hierarchies around race, gender, and sexuality, it gets read as fragility, lack of ambition, or moral collapse, instead of what it often is, a pretty rational response to a game that is proven to be rigged. A lot of folks my age or younger talk about home ownership the way boomers used to talk about winning the lottery. And it might be hyperbole, but it's not irrational. None of this means that every young person is a saint or that every criticism is unfair. It scares the bejesus out of me that young people think some rando on TikTok is a trustworthy source of news. I roll my eyes too when I hear some of the shit they say sometimes. People younger than me, I mean. And people can absolutely be selfish, short-sighted, or unserious at 22. They often are. But they can be those things at 42 or at 62 for that matter as well. Look, when the script shows up every single generation, kids these days are lazy, soft, and destroying civilization. At some point, you have to stop and say, okay, America hasn't fallen apart yet despite repeated doomsday prophecies from the olds. So why the hell should we take this youth bashing seriously? Baseline, what's the pattern? If you line these movements up, the market revolution, the Gilded Age, the Progressive Era, the Jazz Age, the Boomers, Millennials, and Gen Z now, the recurring structure looks something like this. Number 1, the world changes because of new technology, new economic rules, new social possibilities. Number 2, young people adapt first. They move, they switch jobs, they adopt new norms, they experiment with identity and relationships. Number 3, older generations experience that change as loss. Loss of status, loss of familiar roles, loss of control, loss of a moral universe that made sense to them. Number 4, instead of blaming the system, Many of them blame the kids. It's emotionally easier to say they're lazy and degenerate than to say the world we helped build isn't permanent, and maybe there was some stuff about it that wasn't so great. Number 5. The same people who were once the kids these days became the next round of scolds. Boomers were once the hippies ruining America. Now they're the ones reposting memes about millennials not buying houses because of iced coffee and avocado toast. And underneath all of this is a basic insecurity. If the way I learned to be a decent adult isn't the way anymore, what does that say about my life, my sacrifices, my choices? I think that's kind of objectively terrifying for a lot of folks. So instead of wrestling with that, they just decide the younger generation must be the problem. But the part that really drives me up the motherfucking wall is the way in which older people often seem to have total amnesia about what it was like to be young. They forget the insecurity, the need to make mistakes to figure yourself out, the lack of perspective that makes you stubborn and think that you know more than you do. Everyone acted like an ass when they were young. It's the gauntlet of growing up. But rather than having empathy for those experiencing it now, a lot of older people just get frustrated and bitter from the starting gun. It is so short-sighted and frankly narcissistic, and it just makes me crazy. I will say, as an aside, at least for the dudes, I think a lot of this is just jealousy. They wish to hell they could be doing what young men are doing, and they hate the young bucks for it. What do we do with this? So what's the point of knowing that Cicero was already doing the "these damn kids" routine 2 millennia ago, and that every American generation has replayed the same drama? There's a few things, I think. First, you can treat kids these days takes the way you treat some internet life coach's philosophy. Automatic skepticism. When you hear nobody wants to work anymore, or these kids don't know the value of a dollar, or they're destroying the country with their lack of values, your historical brain should kick in and ask, what's actually changed in the economy? What technology or social shift is driving this? Who benefits, by the way, from blaming the kids instead of examining why these changes are taking place? Secondly, if you're older, or becoming older, which is all of us eventually, me very much, you can decide not to become the douche du jour. You can say, yeah, things are different. Yeah, some of it makes me uncomfortable. But maybe that's not because the kids are broken. Maybe it's because the world they inherited is, and they're trying to figure out how to live in it. Third, if you're younger and you're constantly hearing that you and your friends are the problem, history gives you a little sanity check. You are not the first generation to be told you're lazy, weak, immoral, or ungrateful. You will not be the last. But incidentally, that doesn't mean you're automatically in the right. But it does mean that older people's discomfort is not, by itself, proof that you're wrong. And finally, the biggest takeaway for me is this. Generational warfare is a great way to avoid talking about the real power. If older people can convince themselves that the problem is kids these days, they don't have to confront broken economic arrangements, policy failures, obscene wealth inequality, or their own role in maintaining fundamentally flawed systems. It's a lot easier to yell at teenagers on TikTok than to look in the mirror and ask, what did my generation build? And who did it really work for? It's also a lot easier to bitch at your grandkids than it is to write your legislator or switch your spending habits so you don't support organizations that wreak havoc on our society. So the next time you hear someone say, this generation is going to destroy America, remember Cicero, flappers, remember hippies and slackers and avocado toast. The kids are always new. The complaint is always old. And if history's any guide, the real question isn't what's wrong with young people today, it's what changed the world that made them this way? And why are we so desperate to convince ourselves it's their fault instead of ours? Thanks for listening. I hope this gave you a clearer lens for looking at the endless whining about young people and maybe a little patience, or at least a better set of questions, the next time someone starts in on how the youth are ruining everything. I'll be back before too long with another round of Past Meets Present. Until then, take care, and do your part not to be the old man yells at cloud guy.